Hello, and welcome to Working Lunch, the Slow Chambers weekly series where we have the chance to sit down with leaders in our community and bring back some of that personal connection that we've been missing during these turbulent times and maybe get to learn some new things about people we interact with or maybe have never met before. I'm Jim D'Antona, President and CEO of the Slow Chamber, and today you'll get to be a part of my conversation with Cal Poly professor Michael Latner. In addition to teaching political science at Cal Poly, Michael is also a faculty scholar at the Institute for Advanced Technology and Public Policy and a senior fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy in Washington, D.C., election law, and social science. His areas of focus are incredibly relevant to our current national conversation and include political participation, campaigns and elections, and voting rights and representation. His previous work on partisan gerrymandering has been cited by the Supreme Court of the United States, and he's currently working on his next book, Gerrymandering the States, Race, Partisanship, and Rewriting of American Federalism, which should be coming out soon. I'm so looking forward to our conversation and digging into the process, participation, polling, and how he got hooked on politics. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Well, as we always ask, kind of first and foremost, where are you zooming in from today?
I am in my compound from Atascadero, California.
Well, we're so glad to have you, and thanks for making the time for us. Let's start just kind of in general. How did you first get involved in politics and policy? Were you an early ASB participant, school president?
That's funny you say that. I was in student government, lost my first election, so I learned about politics the hard way. I grew up in a pretty politically active house. My dad was a pipe fitter, and so he was very active in his local labor union. So I grew up in a union home. And then my brother, who was about 10 years older than I am, was a young disciple of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And so I lived in a sort of politically schizophrenic household, but it provided a great environment to learn about politics and listen to my parents and my brother fight. And then I ended up getting interested in politics myself. I was a pre-law major as an undergrad. And then there really was a one class on public opinion that really turned me on to the science of politics. And that's where I got involved in understanding political behavior and approaching political science from a sort of scientific or engineering perspective. In grad school, I had no plans on actually teaching or being a university professor. My goal was to open up a polling shop. My first job out of college was as a pollster. I worked for the Field Poll for 5 years, which is a legendary research institute in California. And then in grad school, I kind of fell in love with teaching as a profession. It's such a rewarding thing to do. And I also ended up taking some classes from someone whose degree was actually in physics. So this person, Rain Tagapera, was an astrophysicist by training. And I studied political institutions with him. And from there, I really fell passionately in love with the idea of political institutions as structures that shape human behavior. And from there, I went on to look at laws and looking at law from a scientific perspective more so than a legal perspective. And I've been very involved in electoral reform movements and studying electoral research from a comparative perspective, looking at how the United States is similar and different from other countries and what sets us apart from other political systems.
Well, interesting. You just kind of brought up, and previously we've had you at Good Morning Slow right after the 2016 election, kind of. So this may be a little like Groundhog Day, but I was kind of hoping that you could share some perspective and maybe give some context. We've seen some inflammatory headlines claiming that the polling industry missed it again, but did they really, or is there any significant change that's really needed there?
Well, so we can't really know exactly where they were off until all the election data is final and we can look at the demographics and how the sampling and the polling averages differed from the actual results. Certainly there was polling error, and what we can tell so far is that in the more Republican states, the polling error was higher. So the redder the state, the worse the polls were. They weren't as bad in the swing states, and in some states they were pretty spot on. So there wasn't any sort of systematic error other than this general finding that we're seeing so far, which is in traditionally more Republican states, the polling error was worse. And that suggests um, that the pollsters were missing a particular audience. One thing that we know for sure, that it really isn't a function of sampling or polling error, is that Trump successfully had a late surge. There was a rally, and we see this in some of the statistics, like the Arizona in-person votes. Right, Arizona is a state that votes mostly by mail anyways. They're a really good state to study because they didn't change a lot of their election laws like many other states did in preparation for the COVID pandemic. And so we saw there that the vote by mail, which is most of the Arizona vote, shifted toward the Democratic Party and toward Vice President Biden. But that early in-person voting, you could see this bump of support for Trump coming in. And then as the rest of the votes are being counted today and in the next couple days, we're seeing it actually shift back to Biden. And that's because those are they're late votes, but they're actually mail ballots. They're people that dropped off their mail ballots at the poll, sort of like many people did here in San Luis Obispo at voting centers.
Well, and I think that's an interesting, I mean, one of the things from the layperson who's trying to understand polling, a little bit has to be given on margin of error that we don't talk a lot about, right? That a 3-point margin of error could mean a 6-point swing, right?
That's absolutely right. And I think, for your audience, those of you that are familiar with market research, uh, sampling error is just part of the game. And so if in a presidential election, the president or the winner is expected to get, a 7-point margin, well, that could also mean a 4-point margin, and that's millions and millions of votes.
Yeah, and you end up with some really interesting, again, especially when you have some of these anomalies, right, where huge turnout way beyond switching
Right.
on both sides, right? Whether there was a huge turnout on the left or the right, you're not calculating all the unknowns and those things, which are almost impossible to predict.
Well, indeed. And, if you think about it in a broader scientific perspective, science is about studying regularities and about looking at what the average behavior is. And anytime that you have an election where it's ahistorical, and in this case, we're talking about the highest turnout in 120 years in this country. So you're bringing in all these new voters into the system. And by definition, that's going to make the polls noisier because they're shifting demographics, they're shifting partisan shifts because you're just bringing in people for whom there isn't previous data on.
Well, you brought up a great point there. We saw the popular vote vote total crush any previous up for like the last 120 years in terms of percentage of people voting. So some might argue that, that this is describing this overall participation rate is great. We're healthy. Wow. We're still the model of democracy for the world. But
I wouldn't go that far.
right. So that would be my question is, we're still only seeing like 60 something percent, right? Like participation. We still need to improve, right?
Absolutely. We're still, even at this very high turnout level, and we ought to be proud of that. I don't want it to depreciate the fact that millions of organizers and voters and this really is a shining example of democracy working in spite of the rules, not because of them. And so I think the broader point here is that turnout in the United States is pretty mediocre. It's among the lowest of all the developed advanced democracies. And it's primarily because of the rules that we have. We put a lot of barriers in place to keep people from voting. And there's really no justification for them anymore. And California, frankly, does better than most other states. We have automatic voter registration. We have same-day registration. We have plenty of options for voters, in-person early voting, precinct voting, or vote by mail. And those are the kind of things that we need as national standards, because there's really no justification for the inequalities that we see across states. And that's where we see massive inequalities, states having 50% turnout to 70% turnout.
Well, and in looking at some of that, as you're, again, as the scientist, in trying to analyze that, certainly you mentioned a few of the ways to increase, but, what are kind of one of those first steps that we see, or what states are examples that are kind of doing it right?
Well, so California, again, is a state that's doing a really good job in terms of Having made some emergency changes, Governor Newsom's executive orders in the state legislature, we went to universal vote by mail this year for the first time. We were already kind of heading in that direction, but we've now, most counties have adopted and embraced this model, and I think it'll be here to stay, frankly. There'll probably be some more changes in the legislature, but the states that really do it best are those where Republicans and Democrats have come together and done bipartisan reform. States like Colorado is really the model system. They have universal vote by mail. They've broken down all the barriers to voting, and importantly, they have a really efficient administrative system that they've put in place. So they have best practices that they follow for early processing of ballots. They allow voters a chance to correct ballot errors, and they also provide a very unarbitrary system for verifying and validating ballots. It's not up to, one dude in a basement sifting through ballots. They have high-tech machines, and for signature verification, all of their workers go through extensive training to understand the process and to really put the onus on the administration rather than the voter to prove their accuracy. They make it easier for voters to verify and cure their ballots, and they really got a good system.
Well, and that's a great point, and it's really in the the vein also of the opposite of voter suppression, and we've talked about that a bit in this society. We talk about voter suppression, and there's a number of ways that happens. Most of us conjure up the image of physical confrontation, people stopping you, literally physically stopping you from turning people away at the polls, but that's rarely the case. And you talked a little bit about that. And can you shed some light on what like modern kind of voter suppression looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. To your point, when we bring up the word voter suppression, we're often thinking of voter intimidation, right? And intimidation is the physical threat or threat of force against someone to keep them from voting. That's much less frequent than the sort of what I would call passive voter suppression, which is institutional, and that includes early restrictions on registration deadlines, really strict use and selective use of voter ID. So, some states your gun ID is enough to get you a ballot, but your student ID is not. And these are ways that are used to limit the opportunities for voters. Having deadlines for receiving ballots. Some of the big problems that we're seeing, frankly, right now in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin are these deadlines that were imposed by these very gerrymandered legislatures. We knew that Pennsylvania was going to be a problem because the legislature didn't do what it needed to do and allow the local election officials to start processing those ballots early, like we do in California and Colorado and most other civilized states. And so it really is a crisis of their own making, and that's why we're all sitting here waiting to get to the end of the results, is because of the actions or inactions, I should say, of state legislatures and Congress, frankly, as well. We needed about $3.6 billion to provide the emergency infrastructure that was necessary to have a safe and secure election during a pandemic, and the Senate just completely failed to enact that legislation. So this is a crisis of our own making.
Well, you talked a little bit right there. You used a word, and the idea of that we usually have for infrastructure means we're going to build roads, we're going to build highways, we're going to. Is there? I mean, in terms of that, is that something we should be looking at as an infrastructure piece for our country? That voting and the vote tallies and all of the things that go with it should be part of our kind of national infrastructure?
It absolutely is. All the roads that are ever going to be built, all of the health protections that will ever be put into law, all the things, the technology, all of that's a function of public policy. And that public policy is a function of who gets represented in state legislatures and in Congress. And so if our electoral infrastructure is not in good shape, of course we're going to have poor representation. That poor representation is going to lead to bias in legislatures and in Congress and the presidency, and that's going to have a distorting effect on the type of public policy that gets made. And there's a very clear direction that public policy gets made in, and it is to the disadvantage of those who are not represented. And one of the reasons why we have the level of inequality that we do, why we have the racial disparities in health outcomes and environmental outcomes, is because the people that are suffering the burden of those poor policy decisions are not represented in their legislatures. And it really is a stain on our democracy.
Well, and so that goes to a really interesting question. You've talked a little bit there about the different amount of time the state rules, the legislatures, how they create it, and potentially creating some national rules around it, which would create the amount of time, the amount of infrastructure to do those things. How do how can we do that and still maintain that idea of the federal versus the state systems, and giving the people the freedoms, to the states the freedoms, but yet hold ourselves accountable to doing some real change? Do you have any thoughts on
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And federalism is both a bane and a beauty of our system, because on the one hand, many of the inequalities that we see across states are a function of, or a dysfunction of, federalism, I would argue. So you look at inequalities in education and health outcomes and these things across states, which are massive, and that's a function of states not being responsive. So I think the best solution to this is to not set hard lines on what states must do. I think that we can respect federalism, and we can set floors. We can set minimum standards to say that you've got to have your ballots processed within this much time. You can't have lines outside of precincts that are longer than half an hour. And however you want to fix it, fix it. You can, and we can use federalism, and we can allow states to innovate and come up with solutions to these problems, but we need to have minimal federal standards that ensures that every individual, regardless of where they live, has the equal opportunity to vote and have their vote counted.
So, in kind of back to that original question we had and talked about how we're the model, or, that we love to tell that story of ours, and we were probably the first to get out there and do it. But, it seems maybe some other countries have passed us by on how to do it. Are there other countries that really have great examples of how we should look to model, in order to keep our democracy fresh and moving forward?
Sure, there are other countries, and there are also states within the United States that apply best practices, and we can learn from them. So again, I think federalism has an important role to play here. In terms of overall representation, there are absolutely countries that not only have much higher turnout, but have much more accurate representation. And so, in my view, in the work that I specialize in, redistricting and gerrymandering, one of the biggest problems that we have in this country is that we waste a lot of votes. Right. So in our single member district system, Salud Carbajal is victorious, and that's great. But there are, 40% of voters who choose to be Republican, and their votes are totally wasted. And there's no reason to do that. We can design systems so that everyone's vote can count, and we can have a much more accurate representation of public preferences in Congress, and as well as in our state legislatures. And we should be doing that. We should be moving towards more proportional voting systems, like the system that just passed up in Albany. And that's a growing movement across the states that we're seeing, and we should very much be looking at improving our instruments of democracy, again, as thinking about them in terms of infrastructure. And it doesn't matter what party you're from. We shouldn't be designing any kind of rules that advantage one party's voters over another. We should be designing systems that embody the procedure of political equality by weighting everyone's vote equally.
Well, and I think that's an interesting. I'm sure. Again, you're on the front line of this. Do you have a few lines that you could talk about Albany's version of what they're doing to make people understand what maybe some of those fixes look like?
Sure. So their city, not unlike San Luis Obispo, was sued under the California Voting Rights Act because the plaintiffs argued that Asians and Latinos were underrepresented in their city council. And instead of moving toward a district system, which has been the dominant remedy, what they did is set up a system called a single transferable vote. So they keep their at-large elections, they keep their multiple districts. Every voter, gets 2 or 3 districts every election cycle to vote for. But what they do is they rank choice their candidates. And by using a ranked choice method, it prohibits the plurality from dominating every seat, which is what the current system in San Luis Obispo and in the previous system in Albany does, where, one plurality of voters, they can use all 3 of their votes to capture all 3 seats, Ranked choice voting prevents that. It allows minority representation, and it has the additional benefit of not ossifying politics in this district method. So if you're, whatever you're doing with redistricting, if you're districting for racial purposes to get racial representation or partisan representation, you can do that by drawing the lines. But then you're also sort of ossifying that conflict within the city council. The advantage of ranked choice voting in a multi-district system is that it allows for minority representation of whatever minority is politically relevant, whether it's a pro-growth or an anti-growth element, or an LGBTQ issue or movement that might not be geographically segregated, and which might actually be hurt or diluted once we adopt a district system. So I think of adopting districts as kind of like chemotherapy, right? I mean, if you've got cancer and you've got some real problems of representation, districts can fix it, but they come with a lot of side effects.
Well, that's so interesting. In my previous experience coming out of a districted you did end up with fiefdoms, right? Like, I'm not going to mess around in their district. They're not going to mess around in my district. And so there's less of that cohesion around a city. And so bringing it back locally, Paso just had their first kind of districted elections.
That's right.
And there were some definite, issues that just in terms of a race in there. So did you get a chance to look at that at all? And you think that it achieved what it kind of set out to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paso's a really good example of what tends to happen. So in that case, you had a demographer come in. They drew their districts to try to increase Latino representation. They didn't really increase Latino representation. They preserved it, but more than anything, they preserved the incumbency of the sitting council members. And that's what tends to happen in a district system, is that you tend to get safe districts where one incumbent dominates the district and can stay in power for quite some time. Whereas, and I think Paso's a pretty good example where you don't really have the sort of concentrated segregation that you would need to have like a majority minority community. You can't do that. There's no way to draw a district that you get a majority of Latinos that can choose their own candidate. Instead, you can get a plurality district or an influence district. And that's better than the old system. It's certainly better than an at-large plurality system, but it definitely ends up wasting the votes of Latinos if there is that kind of racial block voting where all Latinos are supporting, one set of candidates versus another. It dilutes the votes of those that don't end up inside the district because then they'll never end up electing their candidate of choice.
So that was what I was going to wonder was, obviously there was a point to this, and certainly a segregated past where all certain groups lived in a certain area and they could represent that. But if that starts to spread, and if fair housing laws and all these things that start mixing,
precisely,
yeah, it becomes less effective, right?
Well, indeed. And, if the 2020 election taught us nothing else, it certainly suggests that Latinos are not a monolithic voting group, and we ought not to treat them as such. And it's even more the case with Asian Americans. When you look at the Asian vote in California, it's quite diverse in terms of their partisan preferences and their policy preferences. And so the idea that we can just, draw a district around a particular racial group to guarantee racial representation, that process just doesn't work as well in California, where you don't have the segregation and you frankly have a much more diverse set of opinions.
So interesting. And so, obviously now we're looking at kind of what's happened, what's been in the past. And as you look to the future, kind of what are your hopes for kind of our local political process, or maybe even our state and federal processes?
Well, I'm really hoping, and I've been on this horse for a while, but my personal politics are probably left of center compared to many other Californians even. But I think that we do ourselves a disservice by having such a dominant one-party system in this state. And I've been arguing for many years that the Republicans ought to be the party of reform in California because they're getting their teeth kicked in every statewide election. And it's not from gerrymandering, because we have an independent redistricting commission that actually does a very good job of drawing unbiased districts. But because we still use single member districts, even if you have an unbiased plan, the largest party in that system ends up getting a big seat bonus. And so in the 2018 elections, I haven't done the math for 2020 yet, but in 2018, the Republican Party got about a third of the statewide vote. They're the minority party, but they only got 13% of the congressional seats. And that's not because of gerrymandering. That's because the system is responsive to the largest party. And there's really no need for that either. It's a different type of bias, but it's bias nonetheless. And it means that your vote counts for less depending on which party you vote on. And there's really no need for that.
I think that's an incredible point, especially when you look at, again, one party that doesn't even have to respond to the other party locally, statewide, or federally,
That's right.
is just creates a disservice, and it suppresses votes for those people who are like, my vote doesn't count, right? I mean, you ended up back to that point.
It does, and we know, at least historically, when we look at the South and we look at other dominant one-party regimes, that tends to not be good in terms of public policy. I mean, corruption is sort of inevitable when a party doesn't have to be responsive to its constituents.
Yeah, it's that's fabulous. Really interesting point, and something for all of us to kind of think about kind of as we move forward. So obviously during COVID here, have you found any kind of silver linings or changes that have occurred because of the pandemic that maybe you hope become permanent?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the emergency procedures that were put into place will stick. So, obviously, Tommy Gong was hesitant to move into a voting center system prior to the pandemic, and so a lot of county clerk recorders sort of had their hands forced during this election cycle, frankly. But we did what we had to do, and we now have a model set up that I think will be better than the older model. Turnout looks like it was pretty astronomical in San Luis Obispo. And, there are definitely kinks to work out. But again, I think the more options that you provide voters, the better off you are for all voters, because you're giving people an option to vote multiple ways, and you're making it easier. You're removing those barriers. And by removing those barriers, you're going to increase participation.
It's incredible. Yes, absolutely agree on that. So, here's just a fun question getting to know you. If you weren't doing this work, what type of work do you think you would be doing?
Oh man, if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably be an evolutionary biologist. I think that's probably like the cutting edge, most fascinating things are happening in evolutionary biology right now. And there's actually quite a bit of applications to political science as well. So my background, again, having the somewhat eclectic training that we talked about, I tend to approach the life sciences as one large science. And so I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And there's tremendous ground to be broken in political science as well as the other life sciences. Although, speaking of life sciences, now that I live on the Central Coast, if I had to do it all over, I'd probably be making more wine and beer. Although I do make quite a bit, but I'd probably be doing a lot more of it.
Oh, that sounds awesome. And if you need anyone to come help try it out, I'm just volunteering for that piece.
Samples, right?
That's amazing. Well, it's crazy. We're already through a half hour. I know we could there's so many interesting pieces here to dig into and to think about our democracy. And this is the time. And it's, I think we're seeing so many questions because people don't get to dig into it like you and I do on a daily, monthly, weekly basis. If people are interested in learning more about our kind of local political processes, what resources would you kind of recommend for them?
Oh, I mean, there's a rich group of organizations to get involved with that are working on important reforms and are working to improve democracy. The League of Women Voters does some fantastic work. There are numerous reform groups represent us, and a ton of local organizations. And I think that folks could learn a lot by getting in touch with our student community and the other community groups that are doing a lot to meet many of the challenges, frankly, that we're facing on the Central Coast in the pandemic and beyond. So there's plenty of opportunity to serve and to learn and to become more engaged, including groups like the Chamber of Commerce.
I appreciate that. Absolutely. Well, it's also, if folks wanted to connect with you, whether it's to understand more or to engage you, how do they find you?
I'm around. So I'm on Twitter as M Latner. and people are free to email me, mlatner@calpoly.edu. We give a number of seminars and talks on campus on a pretty regular basis, and so there you can go to the political science department's website and find out what we're doing. And we have a lot of public events that people are welcome to join.
Well, and as I'm sure you've had a incredibly busy week, month, year, what are you looking forward to this weekend? What's on tap?
Oh, I'm looking forward to a couple glasses of wine, a long nap, and maybe just sitting in my backyard and picking the few remaining peppers and flowers and tomatoes that I have, and just and not watching TV.
I think that's great advice for everyone on that one. 24 hours news cycle should not be 24-hour news
Oh,
cycles.
it's exhausting. I think that all of America is exhausted. This has been an exhausting presidential election, but we're going to get through it.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, thanks so much for joining us. We're truly honored. We appreciate you taking the time, especially during these busy times when people are seeking out your opinion. So really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks everyone out there for eating lunch with us. If you want to hear even more about the election and impacts of candidate and proposition decisions on California, we have our State of the State event coming on November 17th, where we'll be discussing a lot of these issues with some great panelists and really diving in. Next week, we'll be joined by Josh Christensen of Sidecar Cocktail Company and The Penny, which should tell us a little bit about how we should get through all of this to talk about how things are going in the restaurant and event spaces. If you have an idea for a future Working Lunch guest or someone you want to learn more about, send us an email at slowchamber@slowchamber.org. Appreciate everyone turning in. Have a wonderful weekend and stay safe and healthy out there.